Good morning, and thank you, Dr. Cordero, for inviting me to speak to you all today. I want to begin with something most of you have already experienced, even if you've never had a name for it. You have a client, they're doing real work, they're showing up, engaging, making progress that's visible and measurable. The symptom they came in with has diminished, the cognitive patterns have shifted, the emotional regulation has improved. By every reasonable clinical indicator, something has changed. And then, several months later, you notice that the gains aren't holding. Not because the work was inadequate, not because the client has stopped trying, but because something underneath what you were working on hasn't moved. Something in the structure of their psychological life that was never quite in view remains exactly where it was, quietly organizing the conditions that produced the distress you were working so hard to address. That experience, and I suspect it's a familiar one. That experience is the question this lecture is organized around. Not why therapy fails, it usually does not fail, but why certain gains don't hold, why certain presentations recur, why a client can make genuine progress in one domain of their psychological life and find that the territory keeps shifting back. My argument today is structural. I'm going to propose that the answer to that question lies not at the level of technique or alliance or even diagnosis. It lies at the level of how the psychological system is organized, how its primary domains relate to each other, how disruption travels across those relationships, and what remains visible when we work within a single domain without a map of the system those domains constitute together. That map is what I want to offer you. It's a framework I've been developing for some time under the name psychological architecture. And what I want to argue today is not that it replaces anything you already know or anything you already do. It's that it extends what you can't see. It's a structural lens. And once you have it, certain things in clinical presentation that previously looked like resistance or complexity or treatment resistance, they begin to look something more specific, something that has a structure you can't describe. Let me start with the landscape we're already working in because I want to be precise about what I am and what I'm not claiming. The field has made genuine progress in moving beyond categorical diagnosis as the primary organizing framework for clinical work. The transdiagnostic movement has established something important. The mechanisms that maintain psychological distress rarely respect diagnostic boundaries. Emotion dysregulation is not specific to any single disorder. Cognitive avoidance sustains distress across presentations that look very different at the surface level. Barlow's unified protocol and the broader tradition of transdiagnostic intervention has shown us that working on a shared mechanisms often produces broader gains than working on disorder specific protocols. That's real. That is an advance. Network models of psychopathology have pushed further still, showing us that symptoms are not independent, that they interact, that some systems function as central activating nodes whose disruption propagates to others. Borsboom and Kramer, whose network approach to psychopathology has reshaped how many researchers think about clinical presentation, have demonstrated that what looks like a symptom cluster may be better understood as an interconnected system with its own dynamics. And yet, even within this more sophisticated language, there is something that remains unaddressed. The transdiagnostic frameworks map mechanisms that operate across disorders. They don't specify how the fundamental domains of psychological functioning, cognition, emotion, identity, meaning, are organized in relation to each other as a structural system. The network models map system interactions. They don't map the domain level architecture within which those interactions occur. The Research Domain Criteria Initiative, launched by the National Institute of Mental Health to reorganize psychiatric classification around biology and behavior, was designed as a research framework and, as its own architects acknowledged, has not yet proven useful to practicing clinicians. And the existential tradition, which has given us our most developed account of meaning as a clinical domain, has illuminated the meaning domain without specifying its structural relationships to the other domains. So here's what I'm claiming: not that the existing frameworks are wrong, not that they're insufficient on their own terms, but that none of them, individually or together, provides a structural map of how the four primary domains of psychological functioning interact as a system. And I want to argue that the absence of that map has clinical consequences. The framework I'm proposing organizes human psychological functioning across four primary domains: mind, emotion, identity, and meaning. Let me be precise about what I mean by each of these because I'm not using them loosely. The mind domain is the cognitive architecture through which the person constructs their experience of reality. This is not simply cognition in the CBT sense, though it includes it. It encompasses perception, attentional orientation, the interpretive schemas that organize incoming information, and the processing patterns through which experience is evaluated and responded to. Beck's cognitive model of depression established that these schemas are not neutral, that systematic biases in interpretation are not symptoms of depression, but organizing conditions that sustain it. Kahneman's work on fast and slow processing established that different processing modes produce different classes of interpretive error, each with distinct implications for behavior and emotion. The mind domain in this framework is the domain of first contact with experience. Its organizational patterns have consequences that extend across the entire system. The emotion domain encompasses affective experience, emotional processing, the regulatory processes through which emotional states are generated, maintained, and modulated. Gross's process model of emotion regulation, which has been among the most influential accounts of emotional functioning at the mechanism level, identifies distinct points at which regulatory strategies can operate, from situation selection through attentional deployment and cognitive change to response modulation. What this body of research has also established, sometimes without framing it this way, is the inherently cross-domain character of emotional functioning. The strategies we use to regulate emotion are selected on the basis of cognitive factors, identity factors, meaning factors. Emotion doesn't function in structural isolation. Its condition at any moment is partially a function of what's happening in the other three domains. Now, moving on here, the identity domain encompasses the organized sense of self, right? The ongoing construction of who the person is, how they understand their continuity across time, what values, what commitments define them. Erickson established identity formation as a fundamental developmental task that doesn't conclude in adolescence, but continues across the lifespan. More recent clinical research has established that identity coherence, the degree to which the self concept is organized, stable, and internally consistent, is not merely a developmental variable, it's also a structural organizing condition of psychological functioning. Nasu and colleagues demonstrated in a cross diagnostic sample that emotion dysregulation is a significant predictor of identity disturbance, not specific to any particular disorder, not an artifact of BPD, but a structural relationship that holds transdiagnostically. When identity is coherent and stable, it provides organizing structure for the other domains. When it's destabilized, that organizing function fails, and the consequences distribute across the system. And then there's meaning. The meaning domain encompasses the system by which the person constructs, organizes, and maintains their sense of purpose, their sense of significance, and coherence with respect to their own existence. In this framework, the meaning domain occupies a special structural position. It is the governing domain. And I want to be precise about what I mean by that because it's the claim most likely to generate resistance. I'm not making a philosophical argument that meaning is more important than emotion or identity or cognition. I'm making a structural claim about consequence. Governing here is a functional and situational description. It refers to the domain whose collapse generates the most comprehensive downstream effects across the system, and whose restoration most reliably reorganizes the others. When the meaning domain is intact and functioning, it provides the organizational logic that integrates the other three. It gives the mind's interpretive activity a directional orientation. It contextualizes the emotion domain's affective experience. It supplies the identity domain with the values and commitments around which selfhood is organized. This is not meaning as primacy, it's meaning as the structural governor of coherence. And when it fails comprehensively. Frankl proposed the will to meaning as the primary motivational force in human psychology, not a secondary function of biological drive, but the organizing orientation of the person as such. The empirical literature on meaning in life has confirmed robust associations between meaning and well-being, health outcomes, and resilience across the lifespan. Steger and colleagues' work on the presence of and search for meaning has provided the measurement infrastructure that has allowed this literature to develop. What that literature has not provided is an account of how meaning's disruption propagates structurally into the other domains. That propagation logic is what the structural models of this framework are designed to specify. Now, before I describe those models, I want to introduce the governing principle of the framework as a whole. That principle is coherence. Coherence describes the degree to which the four domains are functionally integrated, aligned in their operation, mutually supportive rather than in structural conflict, and organized around a common oriented structure that the meaning domain supplies when it's intact. This concept connects directly to Antonovsky's salutogenic framework, which proposed sense of coherence, the experience of life as comprehensible, manageable, and meaningful, as one of the most robust predictors of psychological well-being available. Antonovsky's research confirmed this across populations, diagnoses, and life stages. What his framework described at the level of global orientation, psychological architecture attempts to specify at the level of structural mechanism, the interdomain organizational conditions that generate or undermine that orientation. Coherence is not a destination. It is an ongoing condition subject to continuous perturbation. The system can absorb significant disruption without losing coherence, provided the perturbation does not reach the structural level, provided the domain's interdependencies remain organized and the governing function of the meaning domain remains intact. When it does reach the structural level, the presentation changes in a specific way. It becomes diffuse. It crosses domain boundaries. It resists single domain intervention. And it's at that point that a structural map becomes clinically indispensable. Now, I want to develop the interdomain dynamics through 4 structural models. These models are not diagnostic categories. They are descriptions of organizational patterns, structural conditions that may be present across a wide range of presenting problems and diagnostic categories. Let me give you each one in terms that make it most clinically recognizable. The first model is the emotional avoidance loop. Every clinician in this room has seen it. The client whose emotional experience intensifies despite or because of significant regulatory effort. The client who's working hard to manage, to contain, to suppress what they're feeling, and who finds that the emotional states they're managing keep returning with greater force. The structural logic of the loop begins in the mind domain. An emotional state is registered as threatening, unacceptable, or unmanageable. The mind initiates a regulatory response: suppression, cognitive avoidance, distraction. The emotional state becomes less consciously accessible. The apparent reduction confirms the strategy's effectiveness and reinforces its use. But the emotional state hasn't been processed. its organizing conditions remain intact. The emotion domain continues to process unresolved material, often with increasing intensity, which is precisely what Wegener's research on ironic mental control established, that the effort to suppress a thought or feeling increases its intrusive force. The mind's regulatory burden accumulates. The emotional intensity increases. The cycle becomes self sustaining. Gross and Levinson established that expressive suppression, a mind domain regulatory strategy, increases physiological arousal even while reducing behavioral expression. The feedback effect is biological as well as psychological. The research confirming that suppression based regulatory strategies are associated with worse outcomes across clinical presentation is now extensive. What the emotional avoidance loop adds is a structural account of why the mind domain cannot regulate the emotion domain from outside of it. Regulatory strategies applied within the mind domain have structural effects in the emotion domain that may contradict their intended function. The second model is the identity collapse cycle. The cycle begins with an event condition that disrupts identity coherence, a significant loss, a betrayal, a failure that contradicts a central self concept, or the cumulative erosion of identity stability over time. The disruption activates uncertainty about the self. That uncertainty generates as an affective response, anxiety, shame, existential distress, that the emotion domain must then process. But the emotion domain's capacity to process that material is compromised by the very instability that generated it. Identity provides the organizational reference system for emotional regulation. It specifies what emotional responses are consistent with self concept, what regulatory strategies are identity consistent, what the emotional experience means in relation to the person's understanding of themselves. When identity is unstable, these organizational functions are unavailable. Emotional dysregulation results, not as a secondary symptom, but as a structural consequence. And then that dysregulation feeds back into the identity domain. Emotional states that can't be regulated become part of the self relevant information that the identity domain must now organize. When that information is chaotic or contradicts existing self structures, the identity disruption deepens. The cycle is now self sustaining. The empirical support for this model is robust and transdiagnostic. NASU and colleagues found that emotional dysregulation predicted identity disturbance across diagnoses, controlling for BPD, depression, and anxiety. Huang and colleagues using network analysis and Bayesian modeling demonstrated directional connections between reduced self-identity coherence and maladaptive emotional regulation, with the pathway running through disrupted tolerance of uncertainty, a structural propagation mechanism. Research on identity diffusion has further established that the collapse of identity structure generates conditions not only in the emotion domain, but in the mind domain, cognitive distortion, hopelessness, and the meaning domain, loss of purpose, despair, multi-domain propagation from a single identity domain disruption. The third model is existential drift. This is the one I want you to hold carefully because its clinical profile does not conform to the pattern of acute symptomatic distress, and that makes it easy to misread. Existential drift describes the condition in which the meaning domain loses its organizing function, not through acute collapse, not through the death of a loved one or a diagnosis that reorganizes the person's relationship to time, but through gradual erosion, without a discrete precipitating event, often without the person even being able to name what's happening or why. The client experiencing existential drift is functioning. They're maintaining employment, relationships, the behavioral structure of their life, but they describe a quality of experience that's difficult to name, a flatness, a disengagement, a sense that the activities and commitments that once organized their investment in life no longer carry their former significance. They may not know when this began. They may minimize it. Oh, I'm fine. I just feel a bit distant from things. They may present with symptoms that meet criteria for persistent depressive disorder, while the structural condition organizing those symptoms is a gradual degradation of of the meaning domain's governing function. Frankl described this condition as existential vacuum, a widespread phenomenon characterized not by anxiety about a specific threat, but by an encounter with the groundlessness of experience itself. Yalom formalized it as one of four existential ultimates, noting that meaninglessness is distinguished from the other forms of distress by its particular quality, not fear, but absence. The existential tradition has been clear that this condition is clinically real and clinically distinct. What existential drift model adds to that existing account is the structural propagation. When the meaning domain loses its governing function gradually, the other domains do not immediately destabilize. The mind continues its interpretive activity, but without the orienting function that meaning provides. That activity becomes increasingly self-referential. Rumination without resolution, interpretation without the larger frame that would give a direction. The emotion domain continues to process affect, but affective states no longer connect to the meaning organized motivational structure that would give them signal value. The identity domain maintains self continuity, but the values and commitments around which identity is organized become progressively less activated. Present in self concept, but not functionally engaged. The client is observably present and experientially absent. And that condition won't resolve through emotion domain work alone because the organizing conditions of the flatness are structural and they are located elsewhere. Excuse me. Now, the fourth model is the meaning hierarchy system. And I want to explain why this model is different from the preceding three before I describe it, because the difference matters. The first three models describe breakdown, how the system fails, how disruption travels, how self sustaining collapse cycles form. A framework that describes only breakdown cannot account for how the system builds and maintains what it then loses. Understanding interdomain dynamics requires an account of the constructive logic of the meaning domain, how meaning is organized in the first place, how that organization generates coherence, and what it means to revise it structurally rather than simply restore it. The meaning hierarchy system is that account. It is a generative model. Its purpose is not to describe a failure mode, but to specify the structural architecture within which failure and recovery both occur. The hierarchy is organized from the most foundational level, existential commitments about what makes life significant, what the self is oriented toward, through intermediate levels of value and purpose organized commitment to the most immediate level. Does this specific experience connect to what matters? The levels are not independent. Higher level structures organize the interpretation of lower level experience. Lower level events, when they violate or challenge higher level structures, trigger meaning making processes that may revise the hierarchy. Park's integrative review of the meaning making literature established this empirically, that global beliefs and goals function as the organizing reference system against which specific events are evaluated, and that discrepancies between event meaning and global meaning structures initiate meaning making activity that attempts to restore coherence. The clinical contribution of this model is a distinction. A client who has lost a significant relationship has experienced a meaning disruption. That is real distress. But the structural question is at what level of the hierarchy that disruption is occurring. If the relationship was meaningful within a larger structure of meaning that remains intact, if the person's foundational commitments and a global sense of purpose are not implicated, the disruption is painful, yes, but structurally contained. Meaning can be reconstructed at the level at which it was disrupted. But if the relationship was carrying a larger structural function, If its loss disrupts a self concept organized around that relationship, or removes the primary vehicle through which foundational meaning was enacted, the disruption propagates to a higher level of the hierarchy. Reconstruction at the lower level is insufficient. The structural revision required is at the level of foundational meaning. That's a different condition, and it requires being seen as a different condition. So, what does a structural lens actually make visible in clinical work? Let me be specific about this because I'm not proposing that you do something different. I'm proposing that you see something additional. The first thing it makes visible is the distinction between the domain of presentation and the domain of origin. When a client presents with emotional dysregulation, the presenting domain is the emotion domain. But the organizing conditions of that dysregulation may be located in the identity domain. An identity collapse cycle in which the emotional dysregulation is a structural consequence of destabilized identity rather than a primary emotion domain condition. Or in the meaning domain, an existential drift condition in which the flatness is presenting emotionally, but's organized by the gradual degradation of meaning's governing function. The domain of presentation and the domain of origin are not always the same. A structural lens is what allows you to track the difference. The second thing it makes visible is propagation. When a client's cognitive patterns appear to be a response to a deeper structural disruption rather than its cause, that changes what the clinician is able to understand about what the work is engaging. When a regulatory difficulty is recognized as a structural consequence of an identity disruption rather than a primary emotion domain condition, the reading of the material changes, not necessarily the technique, the reading. The third thing it makes visible is the condition of the meaning domain as the governing domain. This is the most important observational move the framework enables, and the most underused in clinical practice, because the meaning domain's degradation doesn't always present loudly. Existential drift does not present as crisis. It presents as a kind of muted inaccessibility that's easy to read as dysrhythmia, or as a plateau in the work, or as the client's particular character. A structural lens that includes the meaning domain as a governing variable changes what questions get asked and what gets noticed in the material the client brings. I want to be clear about what this framework is and is not. It is not a clinical protocol. It does not prescribe assessment tools, intervention sequences, or treatment decisions. It does not compete with CBT, psychodynamic approaches, ACT, DBT, or any of the other orientations that constitute serious clinical practice. Each of those frameworks operates at its own level of analysis with its own evidential base. Psychological architecture operates at a different level, the structural level, and it offers what each of those frameworks, individually and together, does not: a map of the terrain within which all of them work. What it offers the practicing clinician is three things: a vocabulary, a precise domain level language for describing the organization of psychological functioning that extends what symptom level and mechanism level description can support. It offers a map, a specification of how the four domains interact as a system, enabling structural observation of presentations that cross domain boundaries. And it offers a governing reference, the coherence principle as a structural indicator of the system's organizational status, enabling the distinction between domain level stress within a coherent system and structural degradation of the system itself. Antonovsky's research established that sense of coherence, the global orientation that parallels system coherence in this framework, predicts outcomes across diagnostic categories and clinical contexts more robustly than any single system cluster or mechanism. The implication is significant. The structural condition of the system is a clinically relevant variable independent of symptom level assessment. Psychological architecture provides an account of what generates and sustains that coherence at the domain interaction level. I want to close with the question that organized this lecture because I think it's the most honest place to end. Why do certain gains not hold? Why do certain presentations recur despite competent, earnest, well executed clinical work? I'm not claiming that psychological architecture answers that question in every case. Clinical work is complex and irreducible to any framework, however carefully developed. But I am claiming that a structural map of the domain level architecture, a map that specifies how disruption propagates, where governance flows, and what the organizing conditions of a presentation look like beneath the surface at which it presents, makes a specific class of that question answerable in a way it was not before. A therapist working without such a map may address what is visible, while the organizing conditions beneath it remain untouched. That's not a failure. It's a structural limitation of working without a structural reference. The framework I have described today is offered as that reference, not as an instruction about what to do, but as an extension of what can be seen. What you do with what you see, that, as always, belongs to you. Thank you.